Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you very much for listening. This is part 12 of our series on the Korean War, entitled Requiem for a Forgotten War. In the previous episode of our series on the Korean War, we covered the events of the war's final year, from about May 1952 to July 1953. To recap, although negotiations for an armistice had been taking place intermittently since the summer of 1951, progress was slow going. The two sides, it seemed, were unable to come to an understanding, with the prisoners of war being the most contentious issue. Months passed. The next year came and went. The talks were suspended and resumed multiple times, but there was no indication that they were any closer to reaching an actual agreement. The diplomatic stalemate was finally broken in the early months of 1953. The catalysts for this were important changes to the leadership of both the world's superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. On January 20th, Dwight Eisenhower was inaugurated as President of the United States. The former general and war hero won the presidential election of 1952 in a landslide. He owed his victory in large part to the unpopularity of the war among the American public and his promise to bring it to a prompt conclusion, which could only realistically be accomplished by expediting the armistice negotiations. Then, on March 5th, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin died. Stalin had not opposed the negotiations or even tried to press his Chinese and North Korean allies to prolong the conflict indefinitely, as is oftentimes asserted. Still, his death was a significant factor in that the cadre of officials that assumed leadership afterwards were anxious to de-escalate tensions with the West, and therefore wished to see a halt to hostilities in Korea. Mao Zedong, on the other hand, had indicated his willingness to continue fighting until a more favorable agreement could be reached on the POW question, but when the Soviet government began pressuring him to make concessions to the Americans, he acquiesced. A limited prisoner exchange was carried out in April, and armistice negotiations resumed later that month. Significant progress was made in the following weeks, but there was one final obstacle blocking the path to peace: the Republic of Korea, specifically its president, Syngman Rhee. President Rhee opposed any ceasefire agreement that left Korea divided, and he was perfectly willing to openly demand that the war continue until reunification was achieved. When it became apparent that his ostensible allies intended to disregard his demands, Rhee attempted to sabotage the armistice negotiations by unilaterally ordering the release of over 25,000 prisoners of war interned in the South. This did not lead to the communists breaking off talks again, but it was clear that something had to be done about Rhee. The Americans considered having him overthrown for this brazen act of defiance, but ultimately decided against it for fear of inciting unrest among the South Korean public, who were still largely supportive of the president. American diplomats were able to get Rhee to begrudgingly comply with the terms of the ceasefire, with the promise of a mutual defense treaty and future economic assistance. And so, with the South Koreans brought back into line, they could now return their attention to the armistice. By July 19th, the text of the agreement was more or less finalized. Initially, July 24th had been set as the date for the signing, but delays related to the translation of the document, since the text had to be equally authentic in Korean, English, and Chinese, pushed the date back to July 27th. The final draft contained 5 articles. Article 1 defined the boundaries of the military demarcation line and provided for the creation of the demilitarized zone. Article 2 laid out the terms of the ceasefire agreement and specified a time frame for the withdrawal of all forces from the DMZ. It also established a joint commission consisting of military officers representing the signatories to enforce said terms, as well as a supervisory committee of representatives of neutral nations. Article 3 pertained to the release and repatriation of prisoners of war. I'll elaborate on the details in a bit. Article 4 recommended a diplomatic conference be convened in the future to devise a more permanent solution to the Korean conflict, and Article 5 consisted of miscellaneous terms, including the time at which the ceasefire was to take effect, 2200 hours on July 27, 1953. In his book Ghost Flames, author Charles Hanley sketches the scene at Panmunjom that morning. Quote, "Week-long rains have left Panmunjom soggy with mud. As the appointed hour of 10 a.m. approaches, the sun is struggling to break through the clouds. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the low hills ringing the neutral zone, the thud of artillery still resounds. Minutes later, the delegates enter the hastily built Armistice Hall to sign the agreement that will halt hostilities at exactly 10 p.m. tonight. The T-shaped hall, more like a shed, was erected in a week's time by the North Koreans. Mall panels of thatch are tacked to wooden frames under a roof of upturned eaves, pagoda-like. The North Koreans have sought to adorn the entrance with Doves of Peace, a Pablo Picasso original, but the Americans refused to enter under such a communist symbol, as they called it." End quote. At exactly 10 a.m., the two delegations entered the Armistice Hall. Representing the Korean People's Army was Lieutenant General Nam Il, while representing the United Nations Command was American Lieutenant General William K. Harrison. The South Koreans refused to be party to the agreement and sent no representatives, even in an observational capacity. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army was party to the agreement and would sign at a later point. The atmosphere in the building was highly tense as Nam and Harrison entered, took their seats at two separate tables, and wordlessly began signing 18 official copies of the document, 6 for each party to the agreement. The whole affair was over in just 12 minutes, after which the two generals simply stood up and left. There was no exchange of courtesies, not a handshake, a bow, a nod, or even so much as a glance. The only audible sounds in the hall were those of the photojournalist cameras, and of course, the dull roar of artillery off in the distance. Copies of the document would be sent to 3 other individuals for their signature later that day: General Mark Clark, Marshal Kim Il-sung, and Commander Peng Dehuai. In 12 hours, the war would be over. For the soldiers on the front lines who had spent the last 3 years fighting and dying, matters of grand strategy, victory and defeat, stalemate and advance, rollback and containment, none of these were at the front of their minds. The predominant feeling among the ranks was relief. Relief that their long ordeal was finally at an end. First-hand accounts of soldiers present at the front at the time the armistice went into effect at 10 p.m. on July 27th make note of the fact that the artillery continued to fire right up until the very last minute, and even became more intense as the appointed hour approached. Then, suddenly, at the exact moment the clock struck 10, everything came to a halt. A deafening silence fell over the battlefield. Even people who had advanced knowledge of the ceasefire were taken aback by the abruptness of it all, stunned into muteness by the absence of the incessant cacophony of explosions they'd grown accustomed to. A lieutenant in the U.S. Army, Bill Livesey, said of this moment, quote, "There was no elation. We were just so damn happy it was all over." End quote. Through the night, American and Chinese soldiers gradually began to emerge from the tunnels and trenches they had been sheltering in for the past several months, no longer in fear of being felled by a stray bullet or a shower of napalm. At dawn the next morning, the men looked out at the barren landscape to see, on the other side of no man's land, their enemy. Canadian Army Lieutenant Chris Snyder recalled being fascinated by the sight. Quote, "They all came out. My God, there were thousands of them, more than I ever thought possible. On every hill, standing there, gazing at us. Some of our people thought that they must have been brought forward specifically to impress us." End quote. In the coming hours, there was some limited fraternization as the more bold among them traversed the barbed wire and landmines of no man's land for the chance to see their elusive enemies up close. For most, it was the first time they had glimpsed each other in open daylight. The Chinese handed bottles of beer and rice wine to the Americans, and the Americans repaid the favor with cigarettes and chocolate. In some places, the sounds of music could even be heard, as Chinese soldiers danced joyously to the noise of the horns and gongs they'd previously used to signal their attacks. Scenes like these, totally unthinkable just a few days ago, played out across the entire military demarcation line. As one American soldier clarified, quote, "We were not celebrating victory. We were celebrating being able to go home." End quote. This was the sentiment on both sides of the line. Another American reported hearing a Chinese soldier calling out to him, quote, "Hey GI, no more shooting. We both go home." End quote. For others, the feeling of relief at having survived was marred by a sense of frustration. U.S. Army Captain Clyde Ford recalled his thoughts at this moment. Quote, "This was the first time Americans had ever accepted a no-win war. Everyone else was acclimatized to this, but we were not. To me, Korea had been an abomination. So many people had died, and for what?" End quote. Reactions were similarly ambivalent on the opposite side of the DMZ. Wang Zhugong, a PVA staff officer, offered a nuanced assessment of the war and his country's involvement in it. Quote, "We did our best. We felt that it was difficult to continue the war and conquer the whole of Korea. Still, we did our best. I was happy it was over. We talked to the men in the most down-to-earth manner possible, explaining the situation. They were happy. They never expected to get the whole of Korea. We were told that we were going to support the Korean people in getting the Americans out of Korea, stopping the American invasion. But exactly how far? That was not made clear." End quote. For the men of the South Korean army, news of the armistice was bittersweet, and in many ways more bitter than sweet. They found it difficult to relate to the celebratory attitude of their foreign comrades, because the war had uprooted their lives in a far more profound way than the Americans or the other Westerners. It was their country that lay in ruins at the end. Their homes were destroyed, their loved ones were dead, maimed, displaced, or simply missing. As the guns fell silent across the front, 19-year-old ROK Army Lieutenant Won-mu found it to be a more somber occasion, taking the opportunity to reflect on the nature of war and how it had changed not only his life, but those of everyone he knew. The following passage is from Hanley's Ghost Flames and is adapted from Her's memoir. Quote, "It always seemed that the war would never end. Now that it has, he and his comrades are numb, as silent as the guns. So this is the solution, Her asks himself. And for what? Millions of people killed, but nothing has changed, save for the destruction of human lives and their dreams. His dream was among those destroyed, the dream of a normal, peaceful life. He thinks about all he's been through over the past 3 years. Looking back, he feels miserable at having played a role in the death and destruction. Looking forward, he feels lost." End quote. Won-mu was not alone in thinking this way. In fact, the prevailing sentiment in South Korean society was that the war, the 3 years of hell that they'd just gone through, had all been for nothing. Veterans especially were left bitter and aggrieved at the war's conclusion. As Paik Sun-yup recalls in his memoir, quote, "The ceasefire caused a measure of anguish in the officers and men of the South Korean army because it perpetuated the division of our nation. The lengthy negotiation process had given us time, however, to accept the reality that we could do nothing about it." End quote. Gauging the reactions of North Korean soldiers to the end of the war is a bit more complicated, seeing as how there's not a lot of primary source material that might provide some insight. We may be able to make some inferences, though, if we just take into account some basic facts of the matter. To begin with, the point that I just made about the South Koreans being affected by the war more directly than their foreign comrades applies to the North Koreans as well, even more so, in fact. As you're no doubt very aware by this point, the destruction in the North was far more extensive than in the South, thanks to the relentless UN bombing campaign. Every major city in the North was practically wiped off the map. Only Kaesong had managed to escape total destruction, for the simple reason that it had been in South Korean territory prior to the war, and UNC leaders thought until the very end that they might be able to retake it. For the soldiers of the KPA, not only were their homes gone, but so was practically every facet of modern civilization. Factories, farms, schools, hospitals, roads, railroads, and so on, all had to be rebuilt from the rubble. And on account of the large number of civilian deaths in the North, they would have a significantly smaller reserve of labor with which to do this. Statistically speaking, it was 2 to 3 times more likely that a loved one of a North Korean soldier had been killed, maimed, fled to the south, or was otherwise unaccounted for at the end. As one North Korean soldier later wrote, the Chinese troops that he'd fought alongside may have been happy to return home, but for himself, there was no home for him to return to. For the most part, though, the sense of aggrievement among the South Koreans at the war's end was not perceptible in the North. Instead, most KPA soldiers emerged from the war with an overwhelming sense of relief that the fighting had stopped, even if temporarily, and with a redoubled determination to defend their homeland against future threats, and, not to mention, a burning hatred of the West, the United States in particular. We will expand on developments in North Korea during the post-war period later in this episode. Moving on to a different topic, the terms of the agreement pertaining to the massively contentious POW issue were, to summarize, 1. All prisoners requesting to return home were to be repatriated within 60 days of the armistice. 2. Those not wishing to be repatriated were to be turned over to the custody of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. As outlined in Article 2 of the document, this commission was to consist of 4 representatives of non-belligerent nations, 2 of which were nominated by the UNC, those being Sweden and Switzerland, and 2 being nominated jointly by the KPA and the PVA, those being Czechoslovakia and Poland. The security of both the commission and the prisoners was entrusted to a custodial force from the Indian Army. Once in the Commission's custody, the non-repatriate prisoners were to be held for a period of 120 days, during which time representatives of their home countries would be allowed to talk with them. A conference was to be held after the first 90 days to decide on a course of action regarding any prisoners who still refused to be repatriated. If no such agreement could be reached at the end of the 120-day period, the non-repatriates were to be simply reclassified as civilians and released. Pursuant to the terms of the agreement, the exchange of prisoners of war, codenamed Operation Big Switch, commenced on August 5th, 1 week after the armistice went into effect, and took place gradually over the course of the following month. The UNC handed over 75,823 prisoners, of whom some 70,000 were North Koreans, and the remaining 5,000 or so were Chinese. The PVA and KPA, meanwhile, repatriated 12,773 prisoners, about 3,500 Americans, 945 British, 229 Turks, and 7,800 South Koreans, with the remaining 119 being from various other nations within the UN coalition. Understandably, emotions ran quite high as these prisoners were taken by the truckload to the designated release site at Panmunjom. The Chinese and North Korean repatriates made quite a spectacle of their return, chanting, singing, and holding improvised banners made from bedsheets, emblazoned with slogans like, quote, "Long live our glorious fatherland, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea," end quote. In one ostentatious gesture of defiance, the prisoners removed their UNC-issued prison uniforms and discarded them on the side of the road. The scenes that played out on the other side were a bit more subdued. A makeshift encampment called Freedom Village had been set up just south of Panmunjom to receive the repatriates. As the Allied prisoners disembarked from the trucks that had brought them to the site, it could be immediately observed that the experience of captivity had not affected all of these men in the same way. Some were gaunt and sickly, others appeared relatively robust and in good health. Some were visibly overcome with emotion, falling to their knees and weeping, others laughed hysterically, practically leaping for joy. Still many others portrayed no sign of emotion at all, whether they were overcome with guilt at having collaborated with the captors, or if they had gone mute from the abuse that they had been subjected to for insubordination. The ordeal mentally broke many men. They were confused, disoriented, and their nerves shot and ridden with anxiety. The prevailing feeling, though, was one of elation and relief. One former POW, Ambrose Nugent, later recalled, quote, "Having gone through those periods we did, the death, the starvation, the deprivation, the threat of never being able to return home, reaching Freedom Village was like coming out of a dark night. I felt like I was dreaming," end quote. When reading accounts from American veterans of the Korean War, one can intuit a sense that these men feel neglected, not necessarily by their leaders or the government, but by society as a whole. This, of course, has a lot to do with the understanding of the Korean War as the forgotten war in the popular imagination, which began to take hold before the fighting had even ended. If anything, these men served as physical reminders of an event that everyone just wanted to forget. Former prisoners of war, more than feeling neglected, felt misunderstood. Some details about conditions within the northern prison camps had been publicized during the war, but instead of inspiring sympathy for the prisoners' plight, the public fixated on the reports of indoctrination and collaboration. Returning POWs were treated with a degree of suspicion almost immediately. It was not just old comrades and commanders who awaited them in Freedom Village, but a veritable platoon of interrogators and psychiatrists. The men were pressed for information and endlessly evaluated before they were sent home. In their vulnerable state, confessions were given and accusations were made. The picture they painted was not a pleasant one. 1 in 3 prisoners was suspected of having collaborated with the enemy. As we discussed in episode 10 of this series, the actual proportion of active collaborators, men whose actions were offenses that they could reasonably be court-martialed for, was almost certainly lower, closer to 1 in 10 than 1 in 3. As Army psychiatrist William Mayer summed up the issue, quote, "Too many of our soldiers in prison fell short of the historical American standards of honor, character, loyalty, courage, and personal integrity. The fact that so many yielded to the degree that they did presents a problem of fantastic proportions that should cause self-examination by every American, both in and out of uniform," end quote. The much sensationalized cases of the 21 Americans and 1 Briton who refused to be repatriated only further inflamed public opinion. Their decision to defect absolutely scandalized their fellow countrymen. Western media publications scrambled to offer any explanation they could, in the process making every libelous claim about the turncoats they could think up. These men were from impoverished families and broken homes. They were uneducated vagrants with histories of subversive or criminal activity, won over by the communists with promises of money and power. The most peculiar claim was that most, if not all, were closeted homosexuals, who defected for that reason, somehow. And, of course, there was the popular misconception about brainwashing. U.S. News & World Report gave a comparatively more level-headed analysis. Quote, "The turncoats were lonely, bitter men who felt betrayed by their fellow Americans. They were predisposed to swallow the communist line. They were unable to acquire the self-discipline needed to resist despair in the prison camps. All of them appeared sullen and shifty-eyed," end quote. If we try to step back and look at the situation more objectively, explaining the decision that each of these men made is not really that simple. They all came from a variety of different socio-economic backgrounds and had experienced the war and their captivity in different ways. Now, I won't try to provide a biographical sketch of each of these 22 individuals because, 1, it would be a poor use of time, and 2, I could only find extensive information on about half of them. I will, however, make a few general observations. 18 were enlisted men, 3 were African American, 2 were first or second generation immigrants from Europe. The remainder were white, mostly of British or Irish descent. All but 6 grew up in rural areas, and none were from a particularly wealthy background. Many did indeed have less than ideal family lives, with abusive or absent parents. Only 6 had graduated high school, and none had any notable political affiliation prior to the war. Ultimately, I don't think it can be said that there was any single factor uniting each of them that can explain their decision, and so today we are just left to speculate. Now, I'm sure a few of you are interested in what became of these men afterwards. Again, I can't go over each of these 22 in detail, but again, I'll try to give you some specifics. For this purpose, I think it's worthwhile to return to the story of Clarence Adams that we began in episode 10. To remind you, Adams was a young African-American man, 21 years old as of 1950, serving in an all-black unit of the U.S. Army, the 503rd Artillery, when he was captured during the Battle of Kunu Ri shortly after the Chinese intervention. He spent the rest of the war living in northern POW camps, and like all other prisoners was subjected to the endless political lectures given by his Chinese captors. Unlike most of the others, though, Adams took the messages of these lectures to heart, especially where they regarded racial discrimination in the United States, which is actually one of the reasons he cited for refusing repatriation. After the war, Adams made an earnest attempt to make a new life for himself in China. He studied at Wuhan University and earned a degree in Chinese literature. He then moved to Beijing, where he worked as a translator and married a local woman named Liu Fang. During the Vietnam War, Adams broadcast messages to American soldiers on Radio Hanoi, exhorting them not to fight the Vietnamese and instead to go back home and fight for civil rights in the United States. Adams moved back to the United States in 1966 and lived there with his wife until his death in 1999. Adams' experience is unique in some ways and not so much in others. To begin with, all but 3 of the 22 defectors left China between 1954 and 1966. One of these 3, Sergeant Rufus Douglas, died a short time after his arrival in China in 1954, presumably of natural causes. The reasons for this have a simple explanation. Many of them, like Adams, were homesick. As none of them came from an ethnic Chinese background or had any knowledge of the language prior to immigrating, they found it difficult to assimilate into Chinese society. The problem was made increasingly worse in the period running up to and during the Cultural Revolution, when growing anti-Western sentiment in China made their lives more difficult. This is most likely the reason why Adams left in 1966. He actually stayed in China quite a bit longer than most of the others who left within 5 years. Aside from Adams, perhaps the most interesting of the bunch was James Veneris, one of the only 2 who remained in China through the 1960s until his death. The son of Greek immigrants, he became an ideologically devoted communist during his residence in China, marrying a Chinese woman and even adopting a Chinese name. He worked at a paper factory in the city of Jinan until 1977, at which point he became an English professor at Shandong University. He did visit the US twice later in life, but remained in China until his death in 2004. If you're interested in learning more about Veneris' story and Adams, there is a great documentary called They Chose China that came out in 2005 that I highly recommend. Before we move on from the subject of POWs entirely, I should set aside a bit more time to talk about the Chinese and North Koreans who refused repatriation. After all, there were significantly more of them than there were Americans who made the same choice, even if, as we've seen time and again, the Americans tend to receive most of the attention. As I stated a bit ago, the UNC repatriated nearly 76,000 prisoners of war, of whom the vast majority, 70,183 to be precise, were North Koreans. On the other hand, 26,000 prisoners refused repatriation, 7,900 North Koreans and 14,700 Chinese. If you're following so far, this means that of the approximately 2,700 Chinese POWs in UN custody, at the time of the most recent screening in early 1952, only 1/3 chose to return to mainland China. After the designated period of 120 days elapsed and no other arrangements were made, the Chinese prisoners who continued to refuse repatriation were taken to the port of Incheon and boarded ships that then took them to Taiwan. This was a propaganda triumph for Chiang Kai-shek and his exiled nationalist regime. Chiang's official statement on the matter read in part, quote, "These righteous, stout-hearted men made history when they rejected communism in favor of freedom at the risk of their lives. Their choice leaves little room for doubt. were the people on the mainland to be given the same choice, they too would not hesitate to fight for their freedom in the same heroic manner as been demonstrated by these compatriots." End quote. The defectors were given a rapturous reception upon their arrival in Taiwan, one that was only surpassed by Victory over Japan Day celebrations of 1945 in its grandiosity, according to one eyewitness. The former prisoners demonstrated their fealty to Chiang and the nationalist cause, with gestures that some might find a bit overzealous, tattooing themselves with anti-communist slogans across their bodies, such as "resolutely oppose communism," "exterminate communism," and "fight our way back to the mainland." They also presented the Generalissimo with 17 nationalist flags, the blue sky, white sun, and holy red earth, painted partially with their own blood. The government bestowed upon these defectors the honorific title of anti-communist heroes, and January 23rd, the date of their arrival in Taiwan, was designated a national holiday, World Freedom Day. The Republic of China's officials would make reference to the 14,000 anti-communist heroes, or the 14,000 witnesses of communist tyranny, when arguing the case for their legitimacy. Take, for instance, this statement made by ROC Foreign Minister George K.C. Ye at the UN General Assembly in September 1954. Quote, "That 80% of the Chinese prisoners of war should have decided to choose freedom at the risk of their own lives and those of their families is the strongest attestation of how the puppet communist regime in Beijing is repudiated by the Chinese people living behind the Iron Curtain." End quote. This mass defection of Chinese prisoners of war engendered strong emotions in mainland China as well. This was a massively humiliating outcome for the communists, one that they had been willing to prolong the war to end. As Professor David Chang points out in his very insightful book on this subject, The Hijacked War, approximately 90,000 Chinese soldiers were killed in the final 2 years of the Korean War, meaning that one could argue that to prevent one Chinese POW from going to Taiwan, more than 6 Chinese soldiers gave their lives. Desperate to save face, the communists tried to paint the defectors' decision as the product of some American conspiracy, that they were effectively deported to Taiwan under the guise of voluntary repatriation. For several months, fiery condemnations of this alleged American duplicity were made in official statements and in the media. Take, for instance, this excerpt from a statement issued by Premier Zhou Enlai 2 days after the prisoners transferred to Taiwan. Quote, "The complete political and moral bankruptcy of the United States has been put on full display. No matter where these prisoners are forcibly detained, as long as the Americans do not retrieve them, we will not give up our prosecution of this crime." End quote. The Chinese government did actually drop the matter before the end of the year, upon realizing the futility of pressing the issue. Still, the depth of this humiliation was simply too great to be forgotten. 18 years later, during U.S. President Richard Nixon's state visit to China in 1972, Cho, at the slightest provocation, tried to relitigate the issue, telling Nixon, quote, "I want to mention that the number of our prisoners who were coerced to go to Taiwan was not in the thousands, but up to 10,000 or more. We could have made a big issue, but we tolerated it because we thought it was not good to insist that the war continue over the question of these prisoners." End quote. The truth of his statement was dubious, especially the contention that they were not willing to prolong the war over the POW question, but for Zhou, the truth was of secondary importance, as he elaborated. Quote, "It may be a matter of history, but it is something very much in our hearts." End quote. Given the far-reaching ramifications of their actions, it's worth questioning why the 14,000 defectors made this decision. Some historians have posited that the relatively large proportion of former nationalist troops in the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, 30% according to one estimate, may have accounted for this. As the thinking goes, these former nationalist soldiers press-ganged into communist service during the Civil War and sent to Korea to serve as cannon fodder, intentionally surrendered to UN forces. This may well have been the case in a few instances, but there is no evidence of a strong correlation between prior service in the Nationalist Army and the decision to refuse repatriation. Premier Zhou and other communist officials allege the existence of an American conspiracy, not just because this explanation was politically expedient, but because it made logical sense given their understanding of these events. The sectarian violence between communist and anti-communist prisoners within the UN POW camp at Kyoje had been caused, they believed, by the actions of right-wing Chinese agitators brought into the compounds by Americans for the purpose of coercing the POWs out of choosing repatriation to the mainland. Knowing what we do now about the internal deliberations within the US government, we can conclude that this interpretation of events is inaccurate, though there is a kernel of truth to it. The US Army did engage in psychological warfare against POWs with the intention of converting them into anti-communists, and they had in fact used nationalist agents to achieve this. However, it should be noted that these efforts began well before the US had firmly committed to the principle of voluntary repatriation in April 1952, and at no point did the Truman administration intend to send these Chinese non-repatriates to Taiwan. In fact, President Truman saw Chiang Kai-shek as a liability, and had no desire to pursue a course of action that might prop up his regime in any way. These psychological warfare measures did have the unintended effect of allowing a core of devoted anti-communists, who, according to Professor Chang, constituted no more than 14% of all Chinese POWs, to terrorize the rest, coercing many communists and politically unaffiliated prisoners into publicly renouncing communism. This created a situation whereby practically all of these men, nationalist or otherwise, feared communist reprisal were they to return to the mainland, which ultimately compelled many of these prisoners to refuse repatriation and to go along with the nationalists when they otherwise may not have done so. As it turned out, they were justified in feeling this way. The 6,000 or so Chinese POWs who voluntarily returned to the mainland, similar to their American counterparts, were treated with suspicion. And also, like in the United States, the attitude of the government and the public was influenced to a great degree by the case of the Chinese turncoats. In this case, the parameters defining what entailed collaboration with the enemy were broader. Simply revealing one's rank, name, or unit was a punishable offense. Even the act of surrendering in itself was enough to warrant an investigation. Those deemed guilty of collaboration in these terms were liable to be expelled from the army and from the Communist Party. These punishments may not seem so severe until one takes into consideration that membership in the Communist Party came with substantial material benefits, wage increases, access to employment, and so on, and that losing that membership could have a severe impact on one's livelihood. The atmosphere of suspicion worsened during the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976, a period in which Chairman Mao directed his followers to root out counter-revolutionary elements within Chinese society. Practically all veterans of the conflict, even those who were never captured, fell under scrutiny. In Episode 5, I retold the story of a PVA captain named Zhou Baoshan, who fought during the Battle of Unsan in the First Phase offensive campaign, during the course of which he was severely wounded and transferred to the Engineering Corps after convalescing. During the Cultural Revolution, Zhou was questioned by his co-workers as to his record during the war. They ostracized him and all but accused him of being no better than a deserter. Hundreds of former POWs continued to be punished for their alleged crimes, until a review conducted by the PLA General Political Department in 1980 formally rehabilitated many of them. Concrete information about the 69,000 North Korean repatriates is sparse, but given the fact that Kim Il-sung carried out a large-scale purge of the military after the war, it's possible to conclude that they were treated in a similar manner to their Chinese comrades. Anyway, I've gone on for quite long enough about the POWs. Hopefully, between this episode and the 10th, I've provided a reasonably thorough examination of the topic. For now, though, let's return to the subject at hand, the armistice. On July 27th, shortly after General Nam Il and General William K. Harrison signed the armistice agreement at Panmunjom, copies of the document were brought to General Clark at the UNC's forward headquarters in Munsan-ni, just some 10 kilometers away. Upon signing the document, he turned to the journalists present and, addressing the American people at large, said, quote, "I cannot find it in me to exult in this hour. Rather, it is time for prayer, that we may succeed in our difficult endeavor to turn this armistice to the advantage of mankind. If we extract any hope from this occasion, it must be diluted with the recognition that our salvation requires unrelaxing vigilance and effort." End quote. Clark, who resigned from the army a few months later, expressed his disappointment at having ended his career in what he thought was an ignoble way, stating that he bitterly resented becoming, in his own words, quote, "the first U.S. Army commander in history to sign an armistice without a victory." End quote. More than his wounded pride, Clark thought it was disgraceful that thousands of American lives had been thrown away for an inconclusive result. Though he showed a great deal more restraint than MacArthur, he was sympathetic to his calls to bring the war to China itself. For years afterward, he was never able to fully shake the idea that a more desirable peace could have been achieved in the Korean War through an outright military victory. Clark's immediate predecessor, General Matthew Ridgway, took away a different lesson from the war. Unlike Clark, he strongly disapproved of the notion of expanding the war. In his view, pursuing what he called, quote, "some vaguely defined victory over global communism," end quote, could only lead the United States headlong into more costly foreign entanglements and heightened global tensions. In his capacity as commander of the UNC, he had worked closely with President Truman and his administration to keep the conflict confined to the Korean Peninsula. He was therefore able to find some measure of satisfaction in the way that things had turned out, confident in the knowledge that he had helped facilitate the return of peace. One might attribute this divergence of opinion between Ridgway and Clark to temperamental differences, but it's worth bearing in mind that their experiences of the war were quite different. When Ridgway took command, first over the 8th Army and later as UNC commander, the UN forces were in disarray in the wake of China's intervention. By the time Clark arrived, the military situation had stabilized and a ceasefire was already being negotiated. Moreover, unlike Clark, who retired within months of the war's conclusion, Ridgway remained in active service for some time, and in a capacity to help make decisions regarding military matters, especially after he was appointed as the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff in August 1953. As for President Eisenhower and figures within his administration like Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, their outlook on the end of the war was more ambivalent. On one hand, Eisenhower considered the armistice to be one of the principal achievements of his presidency. He had been elected, at least in part, thanks to his promise to end the war in Korea. And although factors outside of his immediate control probably influenced the course of events more than he would have liked to admit, he had very much staked his political fortunes on the war ending, and had played an appreciable role in bringing about this result. Still, there was no getting around the fact that the war had concluded indecisively. The president's address of July 26th, announcing the signing of the armistice, struck an accordingly somber tone. Quote, "For this nation, the cost of repelling aggression has been high. In thousands of homes, it has been incalculable. It has been paid in terms of tragedy. There is, in this moment of sober satisfaction, one thought that we must discipline our emotions and steady our resolution. It is this: we have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world. We may not now relax our guard, nor cease our quest." End quote. As for the American public in general, their reaction to the end of the war was decidedly muted. There were no parades or festivities like those that were held on Victory over Japan Day a decade prior. Nor was there any large outpouring of grief or really any public reaction to speak of. As one reporter observed, quote, "The mood appeared to be one of apathy." End quote. In his 2010 study of the Korean War, Professor Bruce Cumings provides a sketch further illustrating the anemic reaction in two particular American cities. Quote, "Washington, D.C., reporters wrote, met the war's end with a collective shrug of the shoulders. In New York City, TV camera crews showed up at Times Square to find desultory citizens who had been coaxed into shouting approval of the peace. In fact, fewer people were on the streets that day because subway fares had just gone up to 15 cents. The next day, an Iowa district court ruled that there had never been a state of war in Korea since Congress never declared one to exist." End quote. True to the forgotten war sobriquet by which many Americans now refer to it, the Korean War had begun to fade from the United States national consciousness from the very moment the fighting ended, even before by some accounts. In his 1963 book on the Korean War, T.R. Fehrenbach, a veteran of the war himself, provides some insight to Americans' attitude towards the war immediately after it ended. Quote, "The Korean War ended inconclusively on July 27, 1953. Not until long afterwards was it even dignified by the title of war. The official government euphemism was Korean conflict, and it rapidly became the most forgotten war in American history. There was little in it, from the near-disastrous beginning to the honorable but frustrating ending that appealed to American sensibilities. Because they cannot look back on it with any sense of satisfaction, or even the haunted pride that a defeated nation sometimes finds, most Americans prefer not to look back at all." End quote. This attitude is even widespread among veterans of the conflict. The lack of a clear victory cast doubt on the basic presuppositions that their sacrifices were meaningful, necessary, or even morally correct. More than anything, they found the concept of a limited war to be incomprehensibly frustrating, especially because the last war, World War II, had been the very opposite, a total war. Sergeant James Hart, a veteran of both World War II and the Korean War, summarized these feelings. Quote, "I hated the restrictions placed on the military that kept us from winning the war. The idea of a limited war meant that Washington's politics determined how we conducted the war and the conditions of victory, if there were any to begin with. I didn't want to be in Korea. I didn't really understand how we got involved in that mess in the first place. But if I did have to be there, I wanted to fight, to win, and to go home." End quote. The great irony of it all is that the Korean War is the conflict most singularly responsible for putting the United States on the path to becoming the globe-bestriding hegemon we know it as today. Conventional wisdom holds that the Second World War is what made the US a superpower, but this is only partially true. To use a somewhat clunky analogy, World War II set the stage, while the Korean War was the first act of the drama. After the conclusion of the Second World War, there was every indication that the US would follow the precedent set by the First and demobilize the military and scale down the defense industry in peacetime, to return to a small standing army and geopolitical isolation. To be sure, there were people in government, like Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who wanted the US to take a more proactive role in world affairs, to project its power to counter Soviet influence. That this vision would be implemented was not a foregone conclusion. The Korean War was, in Acheson's words, quote, the crisis that came along and saved us, end quote. The course of demobilization was completely and dramatically reversed. Military expenditures went from constituting 7% of the national GDP as of 1947 to nearly 15% in 1953. Industrial production was ramped up accordingly, facilitating the creation of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower cautioned the public against in his 1961 farewell address. The total strength of the U.S. military was brought up from 1.5 million in 1947 to 3.5 million in 1953. This increase was needed to garrison the myriad of permanent and semi-permanent military installations that had begun to sprout up across the globe in the following years. Interventionism became the default state of U.S. foreign policy. In short, the apathy of the American public to the Korean War is not at all requisite to the significance of its long-term consequences. It isn't just the people of Korea or veterans of the war who live with its lasting effects, but everyone in the United States, and by extension the world. In marked contrast to the general attitude of indifference among the American public, in China, news of the armistice was received quite enthusiastically. As an editorial printed in the July 29th edition of People's Daily, the Chinese Communist Party's official newspaper, illustrates, quote, the people of the capital believe that the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement is the result of the struggle of the peoples of China and Korea and all peace-loving people of the world for a peaceful solution to the Korean issue. In this struggle, the people of the capital have gloriously contributed their strength. From June 1951 to April 1952, the people of the capital donated 93 fighter planes. In the Patriotic Production Increase and Savings Campaign in 1952, the city's employees exceeded the Production Increase and Savings Plan by 146.6%, and the wealth increased for the country reached more than 1.17 trillion yuan. More than 1,200 railway employees from the capital volunteered to go to Korea to participate in transportation work. These people, who made great contributions to the struggle to resist the U.S. and aid Korea, expressed great joy and relief at hearing the news of the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement. Liu Bin, a family member of a soldier in the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, said, we have won the victory against the war of aggression. We have also won the victory of democratic construction, and we are also striving for the victory of the motherland's economic construction. Many workers at the Shijingshan iron and steel plant held a symposium during their break after hearing the broadcast at noon to celebrate the Korean armistice and to express their unanimous support for the armistice agreement. While celebrating the victory of peace, the people of the capital remain highly vigilant against the enemies of peace. Liu Zijian, director of the Shijingshan power plant and a national model worker, said, the signing of the Korean armistice agreement is the first step in the peaceful resolution of the Korean issue. But the peaceful resolution of the entire Korean issue still requires further efforts from the people of China and North Korea and all peace-loving people of the world. He said that he would make a good work plan in August and strengthen the struggle to defend peace with practical actions to better build the motherland. In a hospital in Beijing, the wounded soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army who returned home smiled with victory when they heard the news of the signing of the agreement. End quote. Another editorial in the same edition of the publication reported a similar atmosphere of excitement on the communist side of the military demarcation line at the time the armistice was signed. Quote, yesterday afternoon, the 26th, when the loudspeakers in Kaesong and Panmunjom suddenly broadcast the news that the signing ceremony would be held at 10 a.m. the next day, the crowds were once again excited. Many hats were thrown into the air, children shouted and ran to tell each other. People gathered in large groups in front of the blackboard newspapers, and the laughter from their hearts was overflowing. Until late at night, the loudspeakers were still emitting clear voices and songs. At 5 o'clock in the morning, it woke people up again. The people, as usual, were serious and calm. They were excited and pleased with the progress, but all the same, they were vigilantly watching for any possible sabotage from the other side. The only thing they cared about today was whether Syngman Rhee would violate the agreement again, and whether the United States would seriously fulfill its promises. The workers who were rushing to build the signing hall and repair the bridge at Panmunjom, the farmers who stopped farming to celebrate the armistice, and the adult and underage male and female students were all watching this issue closely. They held a desire for peace and a strong will to defend it. Li Lianshu, a 21-year-old girl, said, when she talked about her feelings about the ceasefire, "I am willing to cease fire, but Syngman Rhee and the American invaders have different intentions than I do. They may create some incidents to disrupt the ceasefire at any time. I used to be in the 5th grade of the Mingday Girls' High School, but because the enemy launched an aggressive war, I missed graduation by a year. My father died of poverty and malnutrition during the war. If the enemy launches another war, I will fight them." End quote. A bevy of official and semi-official statements by Chinese dignitaries and apparatchiks regarding the signing of the armistice were issued during this time, all of which expressed a strong approval of the return of peace. Much like the people interviewed that I quoted from just a second ago, they tended to emphasize the impermanence of the armistice agreement and the need for continued vigilance. Take, for instance, this excerpt from a speech given by Chang Yun, vice chairperson of the All China Women's Federation, also found in People's Daily. Quote, "The Korean Armistice Agreement, which mothers and women all over the world have longed for, has been signed. We Chinese women, together with the people of the whole country, warmly support the signing of the agreement. In order to resist the war of aggression, we once encouraged our sons and husbands to go to the Korean front and supported them with all of our strength. Our goal now is to oppose aggression, to strive for peace, defend the motherland, defend our hometown and our peaceful life. Now we have finally won a glorious victory and forced the provocateurs of the war to sign an armistice agreement. But we are well aware that the signing of this agreement is only the beginning of a peaceful resolution of the Korean issue. We Chinese women, together with the Korean and Chinese people, and the peace-loving people of all the world, must be vigilant at all times, ready to give a resolute blow to any provocative acts of warmongers, and to fight, to the end, to further realize the peaceful resolution of the Korean issue." End quote. In due time, the party line began to shift, and official pronouncements emanating from Beijing took on a decidedly more triumphalist tone. An early example of this is the speech delivered by General Peng Dehuai, Commander-in-Chief of the PVA-KPA Joint Headquarters, at a celebratory banquet in Kaesong on the evening of July 27th. Quote, "This is a happy day for our people. On the Korean battlefield, the Chinese People's Volunteers and the Korean People's Army have fought shoulder to shoulder to help each other like brothers. Fighting side by side for 3 years, the volunteers have forged a strong friendship with the Korean people and their army. A friendship sealed in blood, and one which made even more profound the feeling of international solidarity between our two peoples." End quote. But when Peng sat down the next day to affix his signature to the document, he felt a twinge of regret. Like his American counterpart, Mark Clark, Peng's regret stemmed less from his share of the responsibility for the deaths of thousands of his men, and more from the failure to have achieved a more favorable outcome that would have given their deaths meaning. He put these thoughts to writing in a memoir that he penned several years later. Quote, "Signing the armistice, I thought about how the war had set a precedent for many years to come, something the people would certainly rejoice at. It was a pity, however, that having just become well organized for combat, that we were unable to fully use our might to deliver bigger blows to the enemy." End quote. As for Chairman Mao, his initial reaction to the news of the armistice was tempered by the same sort of remorse. When the Soviet ambassador to China, Vasily Kuznetsov, sent a message of congratulations to the chairman on July 28th, Mao sent back a lengthy reply, expressing his view that the communists had held the initiative and that the war effort could have been sustained for at least another year. But by the time he delivered his first public remarks on the subject of the armistice at a session of the Central People's Government Council, essentially the PRC's cabinet of ministers, on September 12th, he evinced no sign of this feeling of regret. It appears that in the meantime, Mao had devised a more favorable interpretation of the past 3 years' events. In his speech, he declared that the war to resist America and aid Korea, as the conflict was officially referred to in government sources, was a great victory for China, and a hugely significant one at that. He listed 4 reasons for this. 1. They had pushed back the Americans and their allies to the 38th parallel and held them there, and in doing so had secured their own border against this threat. 2. The military had gained practical experience by fighting against a modern, well-equipped enemy, and was now better prepared to respond in the event of renewed aggression. 3. The political awareness of the people had been raised. And 4. A war of the Western powers waged against China itself and a potential Third World War had been averted. This interpretation would essentially become the party's official line, more or less in the way just outlined, and would remain so throughout the Mao era and beyond. The official 3-volume history of the war published by the Chinese Military Science Academy in 2000 reiterates many of these same points. For Mao and the Chinese people more broadly, their success in fighting a global superpower to a standstill and forcing them to negotiate with them as equals demonstrated how far their nation had progressed since the century of humiliation. As Marshal Peng phrased it, quote, "The time has forever passed when the Western powers were able to conquer a country in the East merely by pointing some cannons at the coast." End quote. China emerged from the Korean War as a great power in its own right once again. The nations of the West remained largely hostile to it, but never again would they underestimate China's strength as casually as General MacArthur had in September 1950. Moving on, I'd like to turn this discussion back to the Korean people themselves. As you'll recall from a bit ago, the reaction of the soldiers of the ROK Army to the news of the armistice was characterized to a large degree by aggrievement and frustration. This was the prevailing attitude within the government as well. Although he had been pressured into cooperating with the Americans and abiding by the terms of the armistice, Syngman Rhee continued to publicly express his determination to achieve reunification by any means necessary. The following comes from an interview with Rhee published in the New York Times on July 29th. Quote, "The president was fierce in his condemnation of those who were foolish enough to believe that there was any way to settle the Korean question by peaceful means. Rhee made it clear that in his mind the truce was a temporary expedient, designed to achieve only one end, reunification of Korea under his regime." End quote. Sentiments like this were also amplified by the local press. The headline of South Korea's largest newspaper, the Dong-a Ilbo, on July 28th read simply, quote, "Desolation of failed unification." End quote. It is worth questioning to what extent these sentiments were shared by the civilian population of South Korea. Earlier, I suggested the factor that accounts the most for the difference of attitudes regarding the armistice in the North and South was that their respective experiences of the war were substantively different. And while the devastation wrought by the war was worse in the North in practically every regard, it's worth re-emphasizing here that the people of the South had suffered its effects as well. Thousands of South Koreans had perished fighting on the front lines or were killed in the political massacres and anti-insurgency campaigns that took place in the South throughout the war. Those who survived the ordeal now found themselves uprooted and displaced, especially the thousands of refugees who had fled from the North. Now at the war's conclusion, they could start to bury their dead, track down their missing loved ones, return to their homes or what was left of them, and to start rebuilding their lives. Still, the fact of the matter was that the country remained divided, and roughly along the same lines that it had been before the war. Belying the sense of aggrievement that many South Koreans felt at this state of affairs was a deeper-seated emotion: anxiety. The threat of renewed fighting would loom large over the peninsula for decades to come. The people of South Korea could find some solace in knowing that their national security was guaranteed by the United States, according to the terms of the US-ROK Mutual Defense Treaty that was signed just 2 months following the armistice. The United States would continue to station a sizable number of troops in South Korea, and the commander of U.S. forces in Korea would also, in his capacity as UNC commander, retain a degree of operational control over the ROK Army. The effect of this arrangement was not intended simply to just deter external military aggression against the South, but also to restrain the South from attacking the North. On the other side of the DMZ, the reaction to the armistice was markedly different, again, not in the least because its effects were more immediately felt. For a great many North Korean citizens, the cessation of the aerial bombardment they had been subjected to for the past 3 years allowed them to emerge from their underground shelters that they'd been forced to live in. In Chapter 7 of his book, The Korean War in International History, Professor Haruki Wada provides some insight to the way that the news of the war's end was received in the North. Quote, "On July 28th, the day after the armistice went into effect, 110,000 people gathered in Pyongyang's Central Square for a speech by Kim Il-sung. Standing amid a wasteland of burned-out buildings, the North Koreans were relieved at the end of the bombing. The Korean people had crushed the plan of the American imperialists to turn all of Korea into a colony and a military base to use against the Soviet Union and China," Kim declared. The armistice was the result of a heroic 3-year struggle to defend the freedom and independence of the fatherland. The nation and its people had won a historic victory. The fact that America, the largest power in the imperialist camp, had waged war against our small Korea for 3 years, and been forced to sign an armistice at the 38th parallel, where it had begun the invasion, was proof that the imperialists could no longer attack with impunity." End quote. The tone of Kim's speech, with its hopeful, practically victorious rhetoric, will no doubt strike some listeners as strange, as will his framing of the conflict as a war of resistance to imperialist aggression. After all, had the North Koreans not started the war in the first place? Had they not suffered thousands of deaths and the devastation of their country, only for the fundamental issue underlying the conflict to remain unresolved? To be sure, Kim's attitude on the matter was similar to Mao's, but seeing as how the war never reached China itself, for Mao to claim that the war was a victory was, in a manner of speaking, easier for him to say. Here, I believe it's important to remember that, despite the interventions of foreign powers, the war had begun as, essentially, a Korean civil war. In December 1950, after China's sudden intervention sent Western governments into a state of panic, British Cabinet Minister Richard Stokes put forward an analogy that may make the North Korean perspective on the conflict more understandable to American audiences. Quote, "During the American Civil War, the Americans would never have tolerated for a single moment the setting up of an imaginary line between the North and South, and there can be no doubt as to what would have been their reaction had the British intervened on behalf of the South. The parallel is an apt one because in America, the conflict was not merely between two different groups of Americans, but between two conflicting economic systems, as is the case in Korea." End quote. Now, Stokes' analogy might not be a perfect one-to-one, but I do think he hit on a couple of important points. For one, the Korean people as a whole did not see the continued division of their country as an indefinite state of affairs, nor did they accept the 38th parallel as a legitimate international boundary. Second, the fact that the war was, as he put it, a conflict between two conflicting economic systems can explain why it was so brutal in comparison to other civil conflicts, and why it has persisted for such a long time with no resolution in sight. Moving on, I'd like to turn to more immediate concerns: the death and devastation wrought by the war, with the aim of arriving at some conclusive figures for both. To begin with the devastation part, I'll quote Professor Wada once again. In the conclusion of his study on the Korean War, he states that, for the Korean people, quote, "The legacy of war was one of massive destruction. Gutted buildings and shattered towns dotted the peninsula. Savagely bombed by the United States, the North was particularly devastated. The destruction there was widespread and severe." End quote. One metric that is often used in attempts to quantify this destruction is the tonnage of explosive ordnance dropped on the country in the course of the war, which was approximately 1.2 million. This amount, which is more than was used during the entire course of the Pacific War, gives Korea the inglorious distinction of being the third most heavily bombed country in history, behind only Laos and Vietnam. Now, I've already spoken at some length about the air war and the bombing campaigns throughout several points in this series, and while I don't mean to belabor the point, I think here at the end of our narrative, the subject merits briefly revisiting. Because, as Cumings posits, this is crucial to understanding the Korean War and to understanding the peculiar national psychology of North Korea today. Chapter 6 of Cumings' study on the Korean War opens as follows, quote, "What hardly any Americans know or remember, however, is that we carp and bombed the North for 3 years with next to no concern for civilian casualties. Even fewer will feel any connection to this. Yet when foreigners visit North Korea, this is the first thing they hear about the war. The air assaults ranged from the widespread and continual use of firebombing to threats to use nuclear and chemical weapons, and finally to the destruction of huge North Korean dams in the last stages of the war. It was an application and elaboration of the air campaigns against Japan and Germany, except that North Korea was a small, third-world country that lost control of the air to the United States within days of the war's start." End quote. Determining the total human cost of the war is a complicated matter. A final, definitive death toll may never be determined. It is estimated that between 3 and 4 million people died in the Korean War. Again, the exact numbers are not known for certain, but according to a 2009 study by the Oslo Peace Institute, combatants account for just under 1 million deaths, approximately 995,000 to be more precise. Of these, it is estimated that 214,000 were North Koreans, 113,000 were South Koreans, 401,000 were Chinese, 31,000 were Americans, and 4,000 were other UNC personnel, with the British, Turks, Canadians, and Australians counting for the greater part of this total. As for civilians, there is a scholarly consensus that they accounted for the greater part of the deaths in the war, though the exact proportion is disputed. Some claim civilian war-related deaths accounted for at least 50% of the total death toll, while others claim this percentage may have been as high as 70%. To offer some context to these numbers, this means that the Korean War may have been equivalent to World War II in terms of the civilian-to-combatant fatality ratio, as most estimates place this number at between 60 to 67% in World War II. Estimates of the civilian-to-combatant casualty rate in the Vietnam War, by contrast, range between 30 and 45%. My point here is that the Korean War was disproportionately deadly for civilians to a degree that makes it exceptional in modern history. Excessive civilian deaths during the war can be attributed to a number of causes, all of which we've touched on during the series. Both directly and indirectly, the UN's strategic bombing campaign was responsible for a sizable proportion of civilian deaths, as the two factors responsible for the most civilian casualties, starvation and disease, were both exacerbated by the bombing's effects. As we've also discussed at length in episode 4 of this series, a great many civilians were also killed in the numerous instances of large-scale violence perpetrated against civilians by both sides in this conflict. Taking into consideration the fact that, as of 1949, the combined population of Korea was 28,650,000, even by more conservative estimates, some 10% of Korea's pre-war population, soldiers and civilians, died during the war. This has all been to say nothing of the millions more Koreans who were made homeless or otherwise displaced during the war, or those who were left with permanent wounds, both physical and mental, or the further millions who were separated from their loved ones as a consequence of the continued division of the country. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. On the subject of Korea's continued division, there was every indication that it would remain this way indefinitely. Article 4 of the Korean Armistice Agreement deferred the issue to an international conference, which was to be held shortly after the agreement went into effect, with the intention of, and this is quoting directly from the document, quote, settling through negotiation the questions of the withdrawal of foreign forces from Korea and the peaceful settlement of the Korean question, etc. End quote. Article 5 of the Armistice Agreement also acknowledged the possibility of future reconciliation, stating that it was to remain in effect, quote, until expressly superseded either by mutual acceptable amendments and additions or by provision in an appropriate agreement for a peaceful settlement at a political level between both sides, end quote. Preliminary negotiations to determine the specifics of this political conference, the location, date, participants, and whatnot, began almost immediately but quickly broke down. The Eisenhower administration wanted to avoid participating in a diplomatic conference with the People's Republic of China, which it hoped to keep politically isolated in its status as a pariah state. In particular, Secretary of State Dulles did not want to do anything that might confer any sort of legitimacy on the PRC whatsoever. He explained his rationale behind the administration's hardline stance on China in a New York Times editorial dated March 30th, 1954. Quote, will it help our country if by recognition we give increased prestige and influence to a regime that actively attacks our vital interests? Will it serve the interests of the world to bring into the United Nations a regime which is a convicted aggressor, which has not purged itself of that aggression, and which continues to use force in violation of the principles of the United Nations? End quote. Dulles also believed that by maintaining diplomatic pressure on the PRC, it may be possible to effect a break between them and the Soviets. Citing the split between Yugoslavia and the USSR as an example, Dulles stated, quote, Tito did not break with Stalin because we were nice to him. On the contrary, we were very rough with Tito. End quote. Dulles' insistence on this course of action meant that a final conclusive treaty ending the Korean conflict would continue to be deferred indefinitely, though it wasn't as if the US had any inclination to make any compromises regarding Korea in the first place. However, other geopolitical developments did force them to at least show up to the negotiating table, because in 1953, as one land war in Asia came to a close, another was about to reach its climactic finale. To get to that, we'll have to shift gears a bit to talk about American geostrategic considerations post-Korea. In episode 2 of this series, we discussed the Truman Doctrine, the theoretical basis of the Truman administration's foreign policy post-World War II. The Truman Doctrine aimed at countering the expansion of Soviet influence, that is, communism, throughout the world. One strategy to achieve this was containment. Originally articulated by the statesman George F. Kennan in 1947, the containment strategy aimed to prevent the spread of communism by propping up already existing governments that face the threat, whether internally or externally, of a communist takeover. This, of course, was the underlying rationale behind the decision to intervene in the Korean conflict on behalf of the ROK. There were people within the State Department, chief among them Truman's Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who advocated for a more offensive-oriented strategy termed rollback, which aimed at rolling back communism where it already existed. In other words, to overthrow established communist governments. In the early stage of the Cold War, both of these strategies were yet untested. The Korean War was to be the test that would determine what direction U.S. foreign policy would take going forward. In analyzing the United States' involvement in the Korean War, a few different historians, including William Stueck and Bruce Cumings, suggest that for the U.S., the Korean War may be better conceptualized as consisting of two distinct phases. The first of these, the containment phase, begins with the initial invasion of South Korea and the American intervention in June 1950, and ends sometime in late September when the UNC forces crossed the 38th parallel. The second, rollback phase, began where the containment phase ended, and goes on until the implementation of the armistice in July 1953. The results, I think, are self-evident. The pursuit of a rollback strategy in the second phase of the war was a failure, not only in the sense that the US and its allies failed to vanquish the DPRK, but also in that it led them directly into a conflict of a much larger scale from which they could not easily extricate themselves. Even Acheson, the most outspoken proponent of the strategy, admitted this. On the other hand, they were more or less able to accomplish the limited aim of containment in a matter of just 3 months. These lessons led to the formation of a consensus in Washington, D.C. that containment, and not rollback, was to be the strategy that guided U.S. foreign policy for decades to come. All of this is not meant to say that American strategic thinking regarding international relations in 1953 was entirely the same as it had been in 1947. There were a few other factors to be considered. The Truman Doctrine, as initially conceived of, regarded communism as being synonymous with Soviet influence. But after the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War, China was now seen as an additional vector for the spread of communism. And with the rise of anti-colonial resistance movements in Asia after World War II, the Chinese threat was considered especially dangerous. Admiral Arthur Radford, Omar Bradley's successor as the JCS chairman, voices belief that their failure to fully conquer Korea would not dissuade the Chinese from redoubling their efforts elsewhere in Asia. After Korea, the next flashpoint in this Sino-American contest was Indochina, a French colonial entity comprising the modern-day countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The colony had been in open revolt more or less since the conclusion of World War II. The Viet Minh, a national independence front led by communist revolutionaries, waged war against the French colonial government and their native auxiliaries for years, gradually wearing down their will to continue fighting. In early 1954, Viet Minh forces enveloped 10,000 French troops garrisoned in the town of Dien Bien Phu, located in the far northwestern corner of Vietnam. As they closed in, the prospect of a catastrophic French defeat loomed. These developments were followed with growing concern in Washington, D.C. According to Dulles, the deteriorating situation in Indochina was, quote, more important than Korea, because the consequences of a loss there cannot be localized and will spread throughout Asia, potentially beyond, end quote. It was in regards to the strategic significance of Indochina that President Eisenhower first described the domino effect during a press conference. Quote, we have broader considerations that follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first, and what will happen to the last one is a certainty. So you have the beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. End quote. Elaborating further on the principle, Eisenhower described the potential consequences of a communist victory in humanitarian and economic terms as being an incalculable loss to the free world. Quote, but when we come to the possible sequence of events, the loss of Indochina, Burma, Thailand, the peninsula, and Indonesia following, now you begin to talk about areas that not only multiply the disadvantages you would suffer through loss of sources of materials, but now you are really talking about millions and millions and millions of people. End quote. In short, the matter of containment took on a much greater urgency after the Korean War, but American decision-makers were uncertain on how to proceed. Things came to a head in mid-March 1954 when the Viet Minh commenced their assault on the French at Dien Bien Phu. 1 week later, General Paul Elie, the French Army's chief of staff, went to Washington, D.C. to request American assistance. Meeting with Secretary Dulles and JCS Chairman Radford, Elie discussed deploying strategic bombers from air bases in the Philippines to attack Viet Minh positions outside Dien Bien Phu. Plans to this effect, codenamed Operation Vulture, were drawn up by Admiral Radford and included an option to deploy up to 3 tactical nuclear weapons. The plan was endorsed by Secretary Dulles, Vice President Nixon, and the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Nathan F. Twining. General Elie left D.C. fully convinced that he had secured a firm commitment from the Americans. Matthew Ridgway, at that time serving as the Army's Chief of Staff, strongly opposed the plan. He contended that air support alone would be insufficient to defeat the Viet Minh and to save the French forces. This could only be accomplished with the significant commitment of ground forces in addition, which he thought undesirable. Moreover, he pointed out that the presence of American troops in northern Vietnam would give China cause to stage an intervention of their own, which would in turn necessitate the introduction of further ground forces and lead to a further escalation of the war. In his memoirs, Ridgway lamented, quote, "It seemed incredible to me that we had forgotten the bitter lessons of Korea and were already on the verge of making the same tragic mistake." End quote. Ridgway was the most prominent figure calling for restraint in regards to Indochina, but he was not alone in this. Several other politicians, military officers, and statesmen concurred with him. The media dubbed them the Never Again Club, though whether this name was meant to carry positive or negative connotations, I cannot tell. As for the general public, their attitudes towards the prospect of intervention in Indochina tended to range from skepticism to flat-out opposition. Take, for instance, this anonymous letter to the editor published in the April 3, 1954 edition of the New York Times. Quote, "We, the American people, have only just finished with the Korean War. This so-called police action cost us over 100,000 casualties and an increased cost of living with higher prices that we can ill afford. After reading Secretary Dulles' statement of March 29th, I wonder if we are going to be dragged again into another Korea in Indochina, with more sacrifices and more casualties." End quote. The decision on Operation Vulture ultimately fell to President Eisenhower, who could have unilaterally authorized it if he wished. The president took the concerns voiced by Ridgway and the rest of the Never Again Club seriously, and refused to sign off on the plan without congressional approval. Congress, in turn, insisted that they would not approve a U.S. intervention in Indochina unless it was part of an international coalition. Senate Majority Leader William Knowland stated, quote, "We want no more Koreas, with the United States furnishing 90% of the manpower." End quote. Thus, the initiative fell back to Dulles, who had to secure commitments from U.S. allies, chiefly France and the United Kingdom. He went to Europe in early April for this purpose, but found both the British and French governments unreceptive to the idea. In fact, both parties had agreed to a Soviet proposal earlier that year to participate in a conference intended to resolve current conflicts in Asia, namely in Korea and Indochina. The U.S. had also been invited, an invitation which Dulles opted to disregard. As the date of the conference approached, and with both Britain and France seemingly intent on coming to an agreement with the Communists, Dulles felt he had no choice but to participate in the conference if he hoped to salvage the situation. The Geneva Conference opened on April 26, 1954. Korea was the first item on the agenda, with representatives from the US, USSR, China, the UK, France, and both North and South Korea participating in the talks. The proceedings began with representatives of the two Korean governments announcing their terms for reunification. The ROK representative insisted that the Republic of Korea was the sole legitimate government of Korea, and proposed that UN-supervised elections be held only in the North, on the grounds that elections had already been held in the South in 1948. The plan proposed by the DPRK representative, on the other hand, called for elections throughout the whole country, both North and South, that would lead to the creation of a unified government. The elections would be managed by an All-Korea Commission consisting of equal parts Northerners and Southerners, with no involvement of foreign forces, all of which would be compelled to withdraw 6 months beforehand. This included the UN, which the North Koreans considered to be a belligerent in the war and therefore not a neutral party. The Chinese and Soviets backed the North Korean proposal, naturally, while the US supported the South Korean proposal. France and the UK dissented, however. British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden complained about the intransigence shown by the American delegation. Quote, "In regards to the Korea issue, no reasonable proposition has yet been put forward by the Western side, nor can one be, since the Americans feel obliged to give furtherance to this ridiculous South Korean proposal." End quote. The South Koreans later issued a revised proposal agreeing to nationwide elections, but insisted that the ROK constitution remain in effect until amended, and that Chinese forces withdraw from the north immediately, while UN forces would be permitted to stay and oversee the reunification process. Needless to say, the terms of this new proposal were no more agreeable to the communists than the first had been, and so, on June 15th, the Western representatives issued an official statement declaring that they saw no purpose in further negotiations. The Geneva Conference concluded on the 20th, and although an agreement regarding Indochina had in fact been reached, the Korean conflict remained unresolved. The terms of the armistice signed on July 27, 1953, now remain in effect indefinitely. The country is still divided between North and South, roughly along the same lines as when it was first partitioned in 1945. Two states, both claiming to be the sole legitimate government of Korea and therefore mutually hostile, are suspended in a perpetual limbo, neither at war nor at peace. In a sense, the situation in Korea was the Cold War in microcosm, with one crucial difference being that, unlike the belligerents of the Cold War proper, the two Korean states did not maintain even nominal diplomatic contact with each other. Both are what political scientists call garrison states, characterized by massive standing armies maintained by compulsory military service and where national defense takes preeminence in political matters. Mutual defense treaties with their respective foreign backers give both states a reasonable expectation that the other will be deterred from renewed aggression, but by the same token, these alliances mean that both Koreas are incapable of unilateral military action against the other. And so, the two armed camps on either side of the demilitarized zone that bisects the peninsula are engaged in a decades-long standoff. The tension, despite some limited efforts towards reconciliation in recent years, remains unbroken. This is the state of affairs as it continues to exist today, as we are familiar with it. The Panmunjom Declaration of 2018, in which North and South Korea stated their intention to cooperate towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict, was an encouraging sign, but realistically we are no closer to the reunification of Korea today than we were in 1953. With diplomatic efforts towards this end having failed time and again, and the idea of reunification by military means having become more unthinkable as time has gone on, the conflict between the two Koreas has, similar to that between China and Taiwan, transformed into a long-running battle for legitimacy, a contest to actualize their respective versions of a true Korea, with economic, political, and diplomatic dimensions. The way it would play out would be closely tied to the process of post-war reconstruction, and how those processes would diverge, as the armistice had the effect of, to paraphrase Haruki, quote, locking the division in place, separating two societies that then grew increasingly further apart, end quote. And it is to that subject that we now turn. Writing in the immediate wake of the armistice agreement, Sister Mary Mercy, an American Catholic nun who helped run a medical clinic in Busan during the war, claimed, quote, "Korea can lay claim to a sad superlative. It is the most devastated country of modern times." End quote. The governments of North and South Korea would approach the project of post-war reconstruction in different ways and in accordance with their respective economic and political principles. Regardless, one thing was certain: it would be a gargantuan undertaking. Let's begin by discussing the South. South Korea's situation immediately after the war was better than that of the North in some ways and worse in others. To begin with, the population of the South was still twice the size of the North's. According to a 1954 CIA memorandum, South Korea's total population saw a net increase between 1949 and 1954 by 7.9%. This rate of population growth was lower than it was projected to be absent the war, but this did put them in a better position demographically than the North, which experienced a population decrease of just over 15% in the same period. These demographic shifts can, for the most part, be explained by the fact that 1.5 million refugees fled from North Korea during the war. This had been occurring, I might add, from the onset of Korea's division, though the stream of refugees into the South increased significantly during the war. Now, I do not mean to suggest that the people of South Korea found themselves in comparable or better conditions than they had prior to the war. This was absolutely not the case. Their cities and villages had suffered destruction too, especially those closest to the 38th parallel, where the opposing armies swept back and forth repeatedly. Settlements further to the south, at least those that had been spared from the anti-insurgency campaigns carried out by the US and ROK during the war, were now absolutely flooded with refugees. Nearly 1 million South Korean civilians had died during the war, and those who survived the bombs and bullets would now have to contend with diseases like typhoid and dysentery that ran rampant through refugee camps, and that strained the already meager capacity of the state's welfare system to the breaking point. Bruce Cumings summarizes the war's effects on South Korea's pre-existing social structure in Chapter 6 of his book, Korea's Place in the Sun. Quote, Koreans of all classes were now thoroughly displaced from their local roots. Everyone had been jostled, pushed, or thrown out of his or her social niche. Formerly wealthy refugee families from the Pyongan region in the north crowded together in Seoul after the war. Seoul's wealthy residents, who had spent the past several months sheltered behind the Busan perimeter, now returned to the capital to find masses of common people living a hand-to-mouth existence, moving hither and yon looking for work and food. End quote. Again, the population of the South was still nearly double that of the North. The task of post-war reconstruction would be a monumental undertaking in any case, but this demographic reality would play to the advantage of South Korea going forward. Perhaps the only institution in South Korea that emerged from the war not only intact, but in a stronger position than it had been at the beginning, was the military. As you'll no doubt recall, in the earliest phases of the war, the ROK Army was the weakest link of the Allied forces. Time and again, the shortcomings of the South Korean Army made themselves apparent on the battlefield. Poor organization, incompetent leadership, lack of morale, discipline, equipment, and so on. The experience of the war was invaluable in turning the ROK Army into a stronger, more viable fighting force. Its ranks had swelled from 100,000 in 1950 to 600,000 in 1953. The armistice did lead to a degree of demobilization, but the ever-present threat of renewed hostilities meant that the military would retain its institutional importance, and again, with the destruction inflicted on Korean society by the war, the experience of military service would shape the lives of practically an entire generation of Korean men. The military, in the words of Cumings, quote, provided its own brand of education characterized by boot camps, drills, discipline, patriotism, anti-communism, and an authoritarian practice that chilled even the most hard-bitten American officers. In this way, it became an important school for industrial discipline. End quote. Moreover, the military provided an important avenue for social advancement in this period. It could be claimed, not unreasonably, that the military was the most democratic institution in post-war South Korea, as its leaders came from a diverse array of social and economic backgrounds. The military was also far more meritocratic than the government, and it appears to have been largely free from the cronyism that was endemic in the civilian administration. Given all that I've discussed, it's no coincidence that two of South Korea's most consequential leaders after Ri, Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, were both military officers, and that it was thanks to the efforts of these leaders, mostly Park, that South Korea is the economic powerhouse it is known as today. In summary, I think Cumings said it best when he stated that the South Korean military was, quote, the strongest, most cohesive, and best organized institution in South Korean life, end quote. It would remain that way for quite some time. To return to our discussion of the years immediately following the war, the word I've seen most frequently used to describe South Korea in this period is depressing. Apologies for turning to Cumings once again here, but in the same chapter I just quoted from a bit ago, he writes a very illustrative description of what life was like for the average South Korean citizen at this time. Quote, extreme privation and degradation touched everyone. Cadres of orphans ran through the streets, forming little predatory bands of 10 to 15. Beggars with every possible affliction or war injury imaginable importuned anyone with a wallet, often traveling in bunches of starved adults holding children. Half-ton trucks full of pathetic women careened into military bases on the weekends so they could sell whatever goods or services they had. One woman from one of Seoul's wealthiest families once told me that she had been able to save only a handful of jewelry when the war began in June 1950. After her husband was killed, she lived at the margins of Busan's vast agglomeration of refugee camps, trying to feed her several young children. Upon returning to Seoul, she was able to locate the family's residence, only to find less than half of it was still standing, and refugees from the north were squatting in what was left. The whole ordeal had been so shattering that she resolved, should another war come, she would simply commit suicide. End quote. Amidst this destitution, some individuals with an entrepreneurial spirit saw opportunities for advancement. From the moment that the first U.S. troops entered the country, and continuing through the war years, a thriving economy sprang up around American military bases and encampments. Some of this activity was above board, as locals were often contracted to do construction or logistical work. a lot of it could be characterized as black market activity, prostitution, gambling, sale of illicit goods, and so on. The continued presence of the American military in the country after the war allowed this activity to continue unabated, and with the end of the fighting, the markets were flooded with military surplus. Here one can already see the seeds of South Korea's economic recovery, the much vaunted miracle on the Han. Chung Ju-young, the founder of Hyundai, one of South Korea's largest chaebols, or megacorporations, got his start by working as a civilian contractor for the U.S. military. The other major component of South Korea's post-war economy was the considerable amount of aid money that the United States continued to send their way. As we've seen throughout the series, Syngman Rhee was a shrewd political operator, who was not above leveraging the ROK's position in the American-led anti-communist coalition for all that it was worth. If he would be denied his truest ambition, reunification, he was determined to accept massive amounts of American capital as a sort of consolation prize. According to official sources, American economic and military aid to South Korea between the years 1945 and 1965 amounted to $12 billion. For context, this is comparable to the amount of aid distributed to Western European countries after World War II in the Marshall Plan. Throughout the 1950s, American aid accounted for fully 100% of the ROK government's operational budget and was nearly 200% of its annual domestic revenue. And this was only what was on the books. Rhee's government was notoriously corrupt even before the war. During the war, we saw examples of this corruption in action and how it hampered the war effort. See the National Defense Corps incident of December 1950. If anything, this issue only worsened after the war, as increasingly massive sums of aid money made its way into the country. Rhee funneled a lot of this money to government officials, business magnates, and other political allies, but according to historian Jung In-woo, he did not use his position to personally enrich himself to any significant degree, as one might expect. This misappropriation of funds stymied South Korea's economic development. For several years after the war, the South Korean economy lay stagnant, at levels that some observers point out were comparable to third world countries. The United States was committed to propping up an anti-communist government in Korea both indefinitely and unconditionally, but the total lack of economic development did not inspire their confidence. Writing of South Korea in the year 1965, political scientist James W. Morley assessed their situation as follows, quote, "It has made very little progress. It has remained politically unstable and economically prostrate. The day when it can be more than a dependency of the United States has not only not dawned, but now cannot even be foreseen." End quote. Morley and other like-minded individuals within the State Department had hoped that South Korea would eventually become, if not fully economically independent, then at least economically viable along similar lines to Japan, that is to say, not entirely reliant on American aid. Many correctly identified Syngman Rhee and his government as the main impediment to South Korea's economic development. They were certainly none too pleased with the raw deal that he was giving them, and his continued use of heavy-handed authoritarian tactics in suppressing political opposition left a bad taste in their mouths. In fact, even though the war had ended, Rhee's style of rule did not change very much. Sure, South Korean troops were no longer carrying out large-scale massacres as they had during the war and in the years leading up to it, but Rhee continued to rely on censorship, police terrorism, and election rigging to remain in power. He won re-election in 1956 and was preparing to run for a fourth consecutive term in 1960. During the war, the Americans had, at several different points, considered taking active measures to remove Rhee from power, but they ultimately decided against this course of action for fear of destabilizing the country. After all, he was 85 years old as of 1960, over a decade after a CIA memorandum described him as, quote, "congenitally suspicious, obtuse, stubborn beyond all measure, and quite possibly senile." End quote. By this point, they were probably hoping that he would just drop dead at any moment and spare them the trouble of ousting him. Ultimately, this problem would resolve itself, but not in a way that the people at the CIA thought likely, because, as it turned out, they were not the only ones who were losing patience with Rhee. But before we get to Syngman Rhee's downfall, let's first turn our attention back to the North and its post-war reconstruction. We've already spoken at great length about the devastation inflicted on the North during the war, and I do not intend to belabor the point any further here, but suffice it to say that after having lost more than 11% of its pre-war population to death or immigration, and with practically all of its infrastructure in ruins, the path to reconstruction was certain to be long and arduous. I will make a point to say that everything I mentioned about the large-scale social dislocation and the now moribund status of pre-war social institutions in the South was even more applicable in the North. In a way, this worked to the regime's advantage, as it made the restructuring of Korean society along socialist lines a far more straightforward task. Materially speaking, just as the South was almost entirely dependent on the United States to aid its post-war recovery, so too was the North reliant on aid from China and the USSR, at least initially. The Soviet government agreed to cancel all of the DPRK's outstanding loan debts, and together with the other nations of the Eastern Bloc sent billions of dollars worth of aid to the country. China followed suit in canceling its debts, and kept thousands of military personnel in the country for years afterward to assist with reconstruction efforts. Between this foreign assistance and the centralized economic plans devised by the government, North Korea made rapid economic progress in the post-war period. Within 5 years, their industrial output had returned to pre-war levels, and they continued to outpace the South in terms of economic development well into the next decade. There was another very important difference in the way that Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee approached reconstruction. Whereas Rhee was content to continue strong-arming the Americans into sending him more and more aid indefinitely, Kim saw foreign economic assistance as a temporary necessity. He aspired to eventually make North Korea self-reliant, both economically and politically. He first publicly declared these intentions in a 1955 speech delivered at a meeting of the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party. The speech is quite lengthy and Kim spoke on a number of different subjects, but to summarize, he called for an end to Korean subservience to the USSR and for the adoption of a more authentically Korean political philosophy. To quote from the speech directly, quote, "To make revolution in Korea, we must know Korean history and geography and know the customs of the Korean people. Only then is it possible to educate our people in a way that suits them and to inspire in them an ardent love for their native place and their motherland. It is of paramount importance to study and widely publicize among the working people the history of our country and our people's struggle before anything else. This is not the first time we have raised this question. As far back as the autumn of 1945, that is immediately after liberation, we emphasized the need to study the history of our nation's struggle and to inherit its fine traditions. Only when our people are educated in the history of their own struggle and its traditions can their national pride be stimulated and the broad masses be aroused to join the revolutionary struggle. Yet, many of our functionaries are ignorant of our country's history, and so do not strive to discover and carry forward these fine traditions. Unless this is corrected, it will lead in the long run to the total negation of Korean history." End quote. This was the essence of what Kim referred to as Juche, or the Juche idea. Unfortunately, Juche is a concept that defies straightforward categorization. Even the most knowledgeable Western scholars struggle to articulate exactly what it is. There's no consensus as to whether Juche can be most accurately defined as a political principle, an ideological system, or a spiritual and religious belief. I certainly do not purport to know more than the others who have studied this topic, but I think for our purposes here at least, Juche can best be described as a philosophy of national self-reliance that has guided North Korean politics for the last 70 years, particularly as it pertained to economic, diplomatic, and military matters. Kim's introduction of the Juche idea coincided with a series of purges aimed at expelling pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese elements from within the state and at consolidating his own power. Notable victims of these purges include Ho Ka-ai, also known as Alexei Ivanovich Hagai, the vice chairman of the Politburo, and Kim Tu-bong, the nominal head of state and a prominent member of the Korean government in exile, formerly based in Yan'an, China. Both Ho and Kim were targeted for their affiliations with the USSR and China respectively. Pak Han-yong, former chairman of the South Korean Workers' Party and Kim Il-sung's unofficial second-in-command during the war, was also purged. He was arrested and executed on fabricated charges of espionage in December 1955. In August 1956, the internal opposition, mainly the Soviet Koreans, and members of the pro-Chinese Yan'an faction, tried to mount an open challenge to Chairman Kim during a session of the party's Central Committee, which ultimately failed. The remnants of the opposition then directly appealed to China and the Soviet Union to intercede with Kim on their behalf. Neither Mao nor Nikita Khrushchev, the man who ultimately won the power struggle within the Soviet leadership, wanted their allies within North Korea to be purged, and in September, a joint Soviet-Chinese delegation went to Pyongyang. Representing the Soviet Union was Anastas Mikoyan, while China sent none other than Peng Dehuai, who, as we've seen in the past, was by no means afraid of confronting Chairman Kim. Peng and Mikoyan relayed their government's demands to Kim, namely that he stop the purge and reinstate the purged opposition members to their previous positions. Kim relented and subsequently convened another party plenum, during which he renounced the decisions he had made just 1 month prior. The whole ordeal was hugely embarrassing for Chairman Kim. His efforts to chart a path for North Korea's future independent of foreign influence had resulted in the very same foreign powers intervening in the country's internal affairs. He had incurred the ire of both Moscow and Beijing, which meant that his grasp on power was more insecure than ever. As long as the geostrategic interests of its neighbors, China and the Soviet Union, remained aligned, North Korea would remain firmly under the thumb of both powers. However, the communist bloc was not destined to remain united for much longer. Relations between China and the USSR would deteriorate and eventually result in an open break in the early 1960s. This was a situation that Kim Il-sung would happily exploit to his own advantage, vacillating constantly between one side and the other, while never taking a definitive stand with either. The roots of the Sino-Soviet split ran fairly deep, and there's no sense in rehashing all of it here, but for our purposes, the most important factor leading to the split was the ideological divergence resulting from Nikita Khrushchev's repudiation of Stalinism, first expressed in 1956, the same year as the previously described factional intrigue in North Korea. Mao Zedong, fully intent on continuing to adhere to the principles of Stalinism, came to believe that supporting North Korean dissidents against Kim Il-sung was ill-advised, as he perceived Kim's ideological convictions were more closely aligned with his own than those of Khrushchev. As for Khrushchev, his attention was directed more towards Eastern Europe, where there was rising discontent with Soviet domination, resulting in a full-blown uprising in Hungary that October. With both powers either unwilling or unable to intervene further in North Korean politics, Chairman Kim was essentially given a free hand to finish what he'd started. He resumed the purges the next year, removing nearly all remaining members of the Yan'an and Soviet factions from the government, and ensuring the dominant position of himself and his loyalists by 1958. In October that same year, the last remaining Chinese soldiers in the north withdrew from the country. This is why most scholars considered 1958 to be the year when North Korea effectively ceased being a satellite state and became independent unto itself. However, it was not long before the limitations of Kim Il-sung's economic doctrine began to make themselves apparent. As you'll recall from a few minutes ago, I put forward the notion that Juche can be described as a principle of national self-reliance that guides North Korean policy. Kim's purge of the Soviet Koreans and the Yan'an faction, and his assertion of independence from China and the USSR, can be seen as an attempt to put the Juche idea into practice in diplomatic terms. Juche, of course, had an economic dimension to it as well. Chairman Kim aspired for North Korea to achieve autarky, meaning total economic self-sufficiency. Cumings points out that the way that he went about this was quite similar to what Stalin had done in the USSR in the 1930s, meaning the creation of a socialist command economy with long-term economic planning, agricultural collectivization, and a strong emphasis on the development of heavy industry. The reasons for the successes of the Stalinist economic model have been endlessly debated, as have its shortcomings. For our purposes here, though, I think it's worth pointing out some fundamental differences between the USSR and the DPRK. The Soviet Union was the largest country in the world, with vast natural resources and a massive population that served both as a labor force and a domestic market. North Korea, on the other hand, was quite literally half a country, geographically smaller than the USSR by several orders of magnitude, and with a population roughly equivalent to the Kazakh SSR, just one of the Soviet Union's 15 constituent republics. These limitations would have been difficult to overcome even the most ideal circumstances. The degree to which the North had been reliant on foreign assistance during the period of Reconstruction ultimately hurt them in the long run, especially when the USSR suspended aid payments in the early 1960s, when Kim openly sided with China during the Sino-Soviet split. By the middle of the decade, the breakneck pace of the country's development began to slow. Their 7- and 10-year plans failed to hit their targets, and the rate of economic growth shrunk considerably, from 41% during the 3-year plan from 1953 to 1956 to just 18% annually by the time of the first 7-year plan, 1961 to 1968. This downward trend would only continue. By the 1990s, the economy stagnated entirely and went into decline after the collapse of the communist bloc and the USSR. At the same time that these signs of economic slowdown were beginning to show themselves in the early 1960s, it seemed that South Korea's fortunes were finally taking a turn for the better, developments that were the cause for no small degree of anxiety in the North. In 1960, Syngman Rhee decided to run for re-election to his 4th consecutive term as president. After living under his rule for a decade now, the people of South Korea were about to demonstrate that they were unwilling to tolerate him any longer. Ri's presumptive opponent in the presidential election held on March 15th was Cho Pyong-ok, who died of stomach cancer a month before the election. Voters who opposed Ri refocused their efforts on the vice presidential election in the hopes of defeating his chosen candidate for the position, Lee Ki-pung. When it was announced that Lee's opponent, the former Prime Minister Chang Myon, received less than 2 million votes to Lee's 8 million, it became abundantly clear that the results were fraudulent. Protests immediately broke out in the city of Masan on the southern coast near Busan. Riot police were deployed and suppressed the demonstrations by force. Things quieted down afterwards, and for a few weeks it seemed that Ri might emerge from this whole ordeal unscathed once again. That is, until April 11th, when the body of a student protester named Kim Ju-yul was discovered by a fisherman in Masan Harbor. Kim had been missing since the riots on March 15th, and the cause of his death was very quickly determined to have been from the fragments of a tear grenade that were still lodged in his skull. The entire city of Masan was convulsed with protests, many turning violent. The unrest spread to Seoul, and on April 19th, 100,000 protesters, mainly university and high school students, marched on the presidential residence, demanding Ri's resignation. Police fired on the crowd, killing about 180 and injuring hundreds more. The nation was placed under martial law, but the soldiers largely sympathized with the protesters and refused to attack them. The two highest-ranking American officials in the country at that moment, UNC Commander Carter Magruder and Ambassador Walter P. McConaughey, unsurprisingly did not attempt to intervene on behalf of the government. They instead urged Ri to resign, which he did on April 26th. 2 days later, he and his wife fled the country aboard a CIA-operated airliner. They were never to return, instead living out the rest of their days in exile in Honolulu, Hawaii. A new government, headed by Chang Myon, assumed power in the wake of the April Revolution, as these events are called. Chang led efforts to have the Constitution amended along more democratic lines, creating a parliamentary system, reducing the powers of the president, making the cabinet accountable to the legislature, and so on. These reforms unintentionally led to the government becoming rife with factional infighting, which in turn severely hampered their efforts to handle the social and economic problems that continued to plague the country. This period, referred to as the Second Republic, lasted for just 13 months. Early in the morning of May 16, 1961, a cadre of military officers and about 3,500 men under their immediate commands quietly and bloodlessly seized control of the capital. Caught entirely off guard, Prime Minister Chang went into hiding. The ROK Army's Chief of Staff, Chang Do-young, contacted General Magruder, asking for him to mobilize the U.S. 8th Army to thwart the coup d'etat. Magruder hesitated, reporting to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the government's chances of survival were slim to none. Quote, Chang seems to have little support within the city, and all the powerful men in and around the government appear to have had advanced knowledge of the plan for the coup and have at least not opposed it. End quote. By the time that Washington was sufficiently brought up to speed on the situation, it was far too late to act. Around 4 a.m. that same morning, a statement prepared by the mutineers was read on the official state broadcasting system. It began, quote, the military authorities, thus far avoiding conflict, can no longer restrain themselves. They have taken a concerted operation at dawn of this day to completely take over the 3 branches of the government and to form the Military Revolutionary Committee. End quote. The intentions of this committee were then outlined in 6 points. They were as follows. To strengthen anti-communist measures, to rehabilitate the economy, to observe the UN Charter, to root out government corruption, work towards Korean unification, and finally, to restore power to a civilian government once their goals had been achieved. The mastermind of this plot was Major General Park Chung-hee, a truly fascinating figure in my opinion, who deserves, I think, to have a whole series dedicated to him, but here I will merely lay out some basic biographical information. Park was born in 1917 to a peasant family in a small village in North Gyeongsang Province. Originally intending to be a teacher, in 1938 he tried to join the army of Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state based in northeastern China, with the hopes of bettering his social position. He spent 2 years at the Manchukuo Military Academy, after which he was selected to further his studies in Japan. Upon graduating in 1944, he was given a position in the Manchukuo Imperial Army, which he served in until the end of the war a year later. Most of the activities of the army at that time involved suppressing bands of anti-Japanese partisans, which means that Park and Kim Il-sung could very plausibly have faced off against each other on the battlefield. After the end of the war and the liberation of Korea, Park returned home and continued his military career in the Korean Constabulary, the precursor to the ROK Army. In November 1948, in the wake of the Yosu Sunshan Rebellion, Park was arrested. charged with leading a clandestine communist cell within the constabulary. The sources are unclear as to the true nature of Park's political activities and affiliations at this time. An investigation revealed that he was in fact a member of the banned South Korean Workers' Party, though it speculated that his involvement in the organization was due more to the influence of his older brother rather than to any genuine ideological conviction. In any case, he was sentenced to death by a military court, but the sentence was commuted when he agreed to work with the government to track down the remaining insurgents, his brother included. He was allowed to rejoin the South Korean military by the time the war began in 1950, and spent most of these 3 years in the Army's Intelligence Bureau. At the time of the coup d'etat, Park was not a completely unknown quantity to the American government, but the discovery of his involvement in the Yosu Sunshine Rebellion in his CIA case file was the cause for some concern within the State Department. It is true that Park and his allies were not huge believers in liberal democracy, nor did they make much of a pretense of it, nor were they proponents of capitalism. In fact, they saw unbridled capitalism of the sort that had gone on under the Ri regime as a cause of South Korea's continual poverty and immiseration. In the chaotic early days immediately following the coup, American officials in Seoul, including the CIA station chief, Pierre de Silva, the liaison between the U.S. and ROK High Command, Captain James Houseman, and the aforementioned General Magruder, met several times with Park and his allies so as to better ascertain the situation. They found that Park was avowedly anti-communist, but many remained skeptical. A State Department report dated May 31st, 2 weeks after the coup, concluded, quote, "The declared position of the regime is anti-communist, and the available evidence does not support allegations of Park's continued ties with the communists. However, we can't rule out the possibility that he is a sleeper agent or that he might redefect." End quote. In his declaration announcing the coup on May 16th, Park justified his actions by claiming, quote, "The military revolution is not the destruction of democracy in Korea. Rather, it is a way of saving it. It is a surgical operation intended to excise a malignant social, political, and economic tumor." End quote. In the series of arrests carried out by the military junta immediately upon taking power, corrupt businessmen associated with the previous regime were targeted alongside politicians and military officers. Accused of profiting illicitly off the backs of the common people, Park had a number of them marched through the streets, wearing placards around their necks emblazoned with slogans such as, quote, "I am a corrupt swine," end quote. A form of punishment that was more famously used by supporters of Chairman Mao during the Cultural Revolution in China, which was still 5 years out by the time. Again, American observers were uneasy about Park's hostility towards these more unscrupulous capitalists. But Park was no communist, despite his past indiscretions. His idiosyncratic political beliefs owed more to his experience in the Japanese military than to his brief involvement with the WPSK and the Yosu rebels. Communists or not, Park and his allies had run afoul of the U.S. government with their actions. To be sure, one of Park's stated goals was to decrease South Korea's dependence on foreign countries, the U.S. included, but he certainly wanted to avoid cutting ties altogether, seeing as how South Korea was not strong enough to defend against renewed aggression from the North on its own. The Kennedy administration did try to pressure the military junta into restoring democracy, which they did to an extent in 1963 when Park ran for and won in a general election. In the meantime, the junta hedged on demonstrating their anti-communist bona fides to dissuade the Americans from intervening against them. Fortunately for them, the continuing deterioration of the situation in Vietnam offered them a golden opportunity. When the war in Vietnam escalated dramatically as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, President Park was one of the first foreign leaders to answer American President Lyndon Johnson's call for increased international support. Between 1964 and 1973, at which point all foreign troops were compelled to withdraw from the country, the Republic of Korea deployed a total of approximately 350,000 military personnel to Vietnam to fight alongside the South Vietnamese, the largest such commitment of foreign, non-U.S. troops. For context, Australia, the next largest contributor, sent only 50,000. To elaborate on Park's motives behind this decision, I think that Jager provides a rather succinct summary in Chapter 15 of her book, Brothers at War. Quote, "There was the public relations angle of joining an idealistic and moral anti-communist crusade as a member of the free world. There was also the leverage from the commitment of Korean blood that he could use to maximize U.S. economic and military aid to fulfill his priority of securing Korean autonomy. At the same time, Park's crusade in Vietnam and the ongoing threat posed by North Korea would become powerful sources of domestic mobilization in support of his economic and national security policies. Park would essentially refight the Korean War in Vietnam to win the nation's economic autonomy from the United States and to secure itself from the threat of another war with the North." End quote. Interesting as the story of South Korea's involvement in the Vietnam War is, and as much as I'd love to delve further into this topic, that is unfortunately not our focus right now. To make a long story short, Park's Vietnamese gamble paid huge dividends, both diplomatically and economically. The commitment of South Korean troops to Vietnam, along with Park's decision to restore a nominally democratic government in 1963, had put the South Korean government back in the United States' good graces. The U.S. government, which had been considering a significant drawdown of U.S. forces in Korea under the Kennedy administration, now agreed not to make any such decision without first consulting the ROK government. The flow of economic aid into the country resumed, and in 1965, a treaty normalizing relations with Japan was signed, wherein Japan paid a total of $300 million in war reparations. This infusion of capital enabled Park to enact his economic agenda, which was characterized by, among other things, the creation of a large industrial base oriented towards the production of goods for export, all of which was to be done according to long-term economic plans devised by the state. Park's economic policies were remarkably successful. It was during his tenure as president that South Korea began its rapid transformation into the highly developed country we know it as today. For setting the nation on this new trajectory towards prosperity, Park Chung-hee is remembered as the most consequential leader in South Korean history, though he's far from the most beloved, owing to his historical reputation as a military dictator. Critics are quick to point out that the political stability and economic growth that he is given credit for had only been achieved at the expense of democracy and civil rights. Although he did bow to American pressure to allow elections to be held, it was widely understood that these were just as much of a farce as they had been during the Syngman Rhee era. Park's rule only became more openly authoritarian as time went on. In 1971, he dissolved the legislature and granted himself emergency powers that were codified the next year with the passage of a new constitution that only further strengthened the executive branch. Another legacy of the Park era is the since renamed Korean Central Intelligence Agency, or the KCIA. As I'm sure one can surmise, the KCIA was founded with the assistance of the American Central Intelligence Agency and structured along similar lines, with the important difference being that the KCIA was intended to serve both domestic and international intelligence purposes, meaning that it had law enforcement functions that its American counterpart does not. Park was accused of using the KCIA as his personal secret police force, and it was frequently involved in political activities ostensibly outside its area of jurisdiction, although, to be fair, some accused the American CIA of similar misdeeds. Ultimately, the KCIA would be the instrument of Park's undoing, as in 1979, amidst widespread anti-government protests, Park Chung-hee would be assassinated by none other than his own chief of intelligence, Kim Jae-gyu, for reasons that remain shrouded in mystery to this day. To the great disappointment of the protesters, Park's death did not mean the end of military rule in South Korea. Following a brief interim period, another military strongman, Chun Doo-hwan, would come to power. It wouldn't be for another 8 years that democracy would be restored in any meaningful sense. It would take a lot more protest and hundreds more deaths for this to happen. Anyway, I'm getting way off topic here. The 1960s saw South Korea's fortunes begin to rise, while in North Korea, the first signs of economic stagnation could be observed. According to a report from the Czechoslovak Foreign Ministry, Pyongyang was, quote, following with growing anxiety the developments in South Korea, where younger, more flexible state leadership has been able to bring the country back from the brink of total collapse after the fall of Syngman Rhee, end quote. Kim Il-sung realized that the South, with its newfound stability, revitalized economy, and most importantly its larger population, would catch up with the North sooner or later, likely even surpass it. That is, unless something was done about it. Chairman Kim still clung on to the belief that it was possible to achieve the reunification of Korea on his own terms, but the window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The chairman said as much in a speech he delivered on October 6, 1966. Quote, "The reunification of the country is the supreme national task of our people and an urgent question whose solution brooks no further delay." End quote. Further on in this same address, Kim made it abundantly clear that he felt that any solution to this issue put forward by the United Nations, or any other outside power, was no solution at all but just another imperialist plot. Only by defeating the imperialist menace and driving them from the country once and for all could true reunification be achieved. Quote, "The day of our nation's reunification is drawing ever nearer, thanks to the glorious struggle of the people in both North and South Korea, under the banner of national salvation against U.S. imperialism. Soon the U.S. imperialist aggressors, the inveterate enemy of our people, will be defeated. Already there are signs that their domination of South Korea is being overthrown. The liberation of the South Korean people and the cause of national reunification will be attained." End quote. To his credit, the chairman would back these words with action. This new, more aggressive strategy he proposed had been 4 years in the making by that point, and he did intend to act on these threats, albeit using less than conventional methods. In late 1962, in the wake of the military junta's seizure of power in the South, Kim introduced a new policy aimed at enhancing North Korea's military capacity, consisting of 4 guidelines. 1. To arm the population. 2. To fortify the entire country. 3. To expand political education to all soldiers. And 4. To modernize the weaponry, doctrine, and tactics of the armed forces. This 4 military lines policy is considered to be a direct precursor to the Songun, or military first ideology, that characterizes North Korea to this day. It also had the effect of placing even greater strain on an economy already strained by the country's largely self-imposed isolation from the rest of the communist bloc, on whose aid they had become more dependent than they would have liked to admit. In any case, while these efforts were being undertaken to build up the military, the DPRK would simultaneously begin attacks against the South, using tactics that can be broadly characterized as irregular warfare. This would entail, among other things, the use of special forces for clandestine operations, political agitators to incite leftist uprisings in the South, and small-scale skirmishes along the border. In short, many of the same tactics that were employed in the run-up to the outbreak of war in 1950. This time around, though, Chairman Kim thought that the ongoing war in Vietnam provided a unique opportunity for his plan to succeed. With the Americans focused on prosecuting the war in Southeast Asia, and with a substantial part of the South Korean army also deployed there, Kim thought that he could put sufficient pressure on the U.S. military to withdraw from South Korea entirely. Once the Americans were out of the picture, the newly strengthened Korean People's Army would rush into the breach and quickly overrun the South. Either that or the people of South Korea would rise up and overthrow the Park regime of their own accord. In either case, reunification would be achieved. This was an ambitious plan, to be sure, and just as he had done in 1950, Kim Il-sung made 2 fatal miscalculations. The first was to assume that he would be able to catch the U.S. off guard, and the second was to overestimate the willingness of the South Korean masses to rise up against their own government. North Korean forces began skirmishing with U.S. and ROK troops around the demilitarized zone beginning in late 1966 and throughout the year 1967. But when these actions failed to incite the general rebellion in the South that Kim was hoping for, he decided to dramatically escalate the situation. In January 1968, a squad of 31 elite commandos infiltrated South Korea under orders to assassinate Park Chung-hee. They managed to get alarmingly close to the Blue House, the ROK's presidential residence in Seoul, before they were caught, leading to a firefight with South Korean soldiers and police that resulted in all but 2 of the 31 KPA commandos killed. One was unaccounted for, presumably managing to escape across the DMZ. The other, a man named Kim Shin-jo, was captured, turned on his northern comrades in custody, and, bizarrely enough, ended up becoming a Presbyterian minister at a church outside Seoul. The brazen attempt to assassinate the South Korean president backfired spectacularly, as the South Korean public overwhelmingly sided against the DPRK. Then, just 2 days later, North Korea captured an American research vessel, the USS Pueblo, claiming that it illegally entered its territorial waters, a claim that the U.S. government disputed. The 83 crewmen aboard the Pueblo at the time of its capture were held hostage in North Korea until December 23rd, after they agreed to sign a document admitting wrongdoing on the part of the United States. The ongoing border skirmishes began to subside around the time that the American prisoners were released, suggesting that Chairman Kim considered this outcome to be the best that he could realistically hope for. His much-vaunted revolutionary forces in South Korea failed to deliver, and while the United States had not been induced to abandon Korea, it stopped short of responding to these northern provocations with a full-scale military retaliation. In fact, the Johnson administration had to talk President Park down from responding to the North in kind, warning him that any unilateral military action undertaken on the ROK's part would result in an immediate and complete withdrawal of U.S. military forces from South Korea. In exchange, they offered South Korea over $100 million in additional military aid. Park got the memo and stood down. These events between 1966 and 1967, the border skirmishes, the Blue House raid, and the Pueblo incident, are considered by some historians to constitute a distinct conflict, which is referred to as the Korean DMZ conflict. Others see it as a mere continuation of the war, but however one wishes to conceptualize it, this moment in history was the closest that this frozen conflict ever came to becoming a hot one once again. There would be further violent incidents between North Korea and South Korea, along with their American allies, in the years since, but these have been far more sporadic and ultimately did not escalate nearly as far. For the most part, both sides have ceased unilateral military action against each other for the explicit purpose of restarting the war. In the end, as they say, cooler heads have prevailed. The two opposing camps have settled back into their peninsula-wide standoff, ever vigilant against the threat of renewed aggression. And it is here that things stand to this day. And barring some sudden drastic change in circumstances, it is here where things will continue to stand for the foreseeable future. There's so much more that I could talk about here. The Sino-American thaw and how it affected Korea, the fate of Park Chung-hee, the rule of his successors, and South Korea's eventual transition to liberal democracy, the end of the Cold War and the persistence of the conflict, the ongoing dispute over North Korea's nuclear program, the series of diplomatic summits between the North and South and the US in 2018 and 19, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, I have to end the narrative somewhere, and the way I see it, this is as good a place as any. Now, I'll admit, I agonized over how to give this series a proper conclusion. It's part of the reason why the release of these final two parts has been so delayed. When I first described my goals for this series in the first episode, I said that I wanted to prove that the Forgotten War moniker, often applied to the Korean War, does not reflect the world historical significance of these events. In many ways, the Korean War has shaped the world that we live in today. It set the tenor of the Cold War, redefined U.S. foreign policy, cementing its role as the world's policeman. It put China on its path towards geopolitical ascendance. It demonstrated the United Nations' inability to resolve collective security problems, while also preventing it from becoming a totally moribund institution. It reinvigorated Japan's economy, greatly assisting with its post-war recovery. It planted the seeds of mistrust between China and the USSR that would lead to their eventual split. These are just some of the war's many consequences, and I hope that I've done an adequate job of explaining these throughout the series. At the end here, I would like to once more emphasize the central tragedy of the Korean War. The Korean War was, despite what mainstream accounts of the war might have you believe, an intra-Korean conflict at its heart. It was a civil war between diametrically opposed camps of the Korean nation, fought to resolve the social, economic, and political contradictions of post-liberation Korea. This conflict, which came about in large part due to the tensions generated by foreign powers, was ultimately co-opted by those same foreign powers, who were all too content to pit brother against brother in order to further their agendas. Then, after thousands upon thousands lost their lives, after thousands more lives were irrevocably damaged, the foreign powers were just as content to restore the pre-war status quo, to leave the Korean nation divided, and to leave the contradictions that had caused the conflict in the first place unresolved. To them it made little difference if the dead souls found no solace in the notion that their sacrifices had meant something, anything, or if the living souls were constantly haunted by the specter of war. After all, as the old aphorism goes, in a battle of whales, the shrimp's back is broken. I'd like to leave you with two selections of poetry from the Korean poet Ku Sung, as printed in the anthology Brother Enemy Poems of the Korean War. Both come from a compilation of his poetry called Poetry on Burnt Ground. The first is a reflection on the eternal bond between these brothers turned enemies and a prayer for reconciliation. Quote, "The souls lying here in neat rows won't be able to rest. We were firing at you until yesterday, but we culled your bones with these very hands and buried you carefully, choosing a sunny plot on this secluded hill, and planted grass on the mounds as well. Death has the mysterious power to make us transcend love and hate. If you should try to return to your hometowns, you'll be blocked by the mountains before you go 30 li. The silence of the mountain, owned by neither side, weighs on my heart like a ton of iron. We were bound to you in life by ties of hate, but now your lingering resentments are my responsibility, and are incorporated in my prayers. In the spring sky overhead, a leisurely cloud drifts to the north. I burst into tears at this grave of dear enemies, at the sound of cannon in the distance." End quote. The second is a lamentation for the divided nation. Quote, "My fatherland. The poet grows tearful when he calls your name. All the butchers of the century are carving you up like a piece of meat. Heaven seems to just look on. My fatherland. On your streets people go mad, unable to hope or even to despair. Your enemy and the enemy's patrons are trying to slice you up again. Are you nothing more than a reed that gets mowed down? my fatherland, O country of resentful ghosts, your only constant companion has been calamity. Once again your trusting and threadbare children are shaking their fists at Panmunjom with desperate fury, but we hear no song to console the dead souls. O fatherland, my fatherland." End quote. And with that, I now bring this series to a close. I hope that these 12 episodes have helped to shed some light on this conflict obscured by ignorance and misunderstanding. Do you have any thoughts on the Korean War? Questions about the series? Is there anything I explained poorly, or not extensively enough, things I may have gotten wrong, or things I've missed? These and all other queries and thoughts can be directed to my email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also reach me on Twitter or Facebook. Links to both will be in the episode's description. I also encourage you to check out the show's website, also linked in the description. Until next time, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.